And hello, everyone. So, good morning to those of us here in Australia, New Zealand. Good afternoon to friends in Canada, US, and elsewhere. My name is Michael Haynes, and welcome to Breaking Through in B2B. Breaking Through in B2B is a live stream show aimed at helping small, medium business owners operating in the world of B2B. Our aim is to educate, inspire, empower fellow SME owners. It is my pleasure today to welcome a very special guest. He's an author, he's a lecturer, mentor, consultant, author of the great book, The Sales MBA, How to Influence Corporate Buyers. Please let me to my great pleasure in welcoming fellow Ontarian and Torontonian, even though I'm currently now in Sydney, Douglas. Douglas, how are you? Great to have you on the show today.
It's great to be here. Nice to see you, Michael. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. So Douglas, your book, The Sales MBA, I think it's a fantastic book. It is a timely book. Do you actually happen to have a copy that you can show the cover of, folks? I have read your book, but I bought a Kindle version. Yes, folks, The Sales MBA, absolutely, it is gold. Douglas, to kick off the conversation, can you tell us, what was your why? What inspired you to write this book, which is so important and timely at this point in time?
Yeah, I think what inspired me to write it was that I just have probably a natural, somewhat obsessive tendency. If I'm working within some sort of complex domain, I take it as a mission to try to understand what's really going on and try to distill my learnings down into some core principles. And so that's the thing that really hit me with sales. I don't have a traditional sales background. I got into sales, as many people do, somewhat by accident. I was working in consulting before, got into sales, discovered somewhat to my surprise that there were many interesting things about it. The psychological dimensions, the strategic dimensions, the kind of systematic components of what it takes to be successful. And as I got deeper and deeper into sales, I became more and more obsessed with trying to boil everything down to some kind of teachable framework. I'm sort of a natural teacher by inclination. I do teaching work outside of LinkedIn, as you said, with the Rotman School and the Schulich School, some business schools here, local business schools. And
very good business school.
Yeah, and I'm sorry?
I said very good business schools at that.
Yeah, very, very good. Yes, they are. They definitely have deservedly high reputations. And so I, at some point, decided that I really wanted to try to take my learnings and put them into some sort of book form, because I had been I'd been running these experiments internally within LinkedIn. I developed a program called the Mini MBA for Sales. I tested it out with a bunch of teams, and it was getting feedback, and generally positive feedback. And so eventually I thought, okay, well, I need to take these learnings and I need to formalize them in some way. And then I decided, okay, it's going to be more painful not to write a book than it is to write a book. And so that's when I formally requested the leave of absence, took a few months off, wrote the manuscript, and here we are. So that's the story.
Fantastic. Great story. So Douglas, I'd be interested to know your perspective. Over the past, I would say 12 months or so, there's been a lot of talk about, the changes with the B2B buyers in terms of more people being involved, buyers having the power. They're using more sources, involving more people. Can you kind of tell me from your perspective, given that you've written the book and how heavily you're involved in sales, mentoring sales, what have you been seeing over the past 6 to 12 months in terms of any changes, evolutions of today's B2B buyers, and particularly those in the large end, because a lot of our listeners are small, medium companies that are looking to get into the bigger end of town. So can you kind of talk us through what have been some of your observations with respect to the B2B buyers in terms of how they buy?
Yeah, sure. I would say there are three trends that are worth mentioning, and I would say information trends, which is sort of a broad, let's call it sort of secular trend that's been in evidence for some time. That's one thing. I would say that COVID is another development that has just set off a whole chain of reactions that's also playing itself out. And then I would say that AI is the third dimension. So to me, those seem like the most important three trends to understand with respect to knowledge work and sales in particular. So first of all, on information trends, I think just the reality is that, I'm not saying anything that anyone hasn't already discovered for themselves. But the reality is that informationally, we are, as a species, we are generating just terabytes of data on a regular basis and just putting that out into the world. And every single industry is getting more and more informationally dense, more and more complicated. We're building more nodes, more information nodes within those spaces. And so it's just getting really, really difficult to stay on top of these developments. And that information trend has had some really noticeable implications on the design of organizations. There are more specialist areas in order to be able to manage these different informational silos. That has led to more roles. It has led to more stakeholders that are involved in any sale, particularly a complicated corporate sale. So this is one of the main reasons, when you go back to first principles, this is one of the main reasons why CEB and Gartner, who've been tracking the average number of buyers in a typical corporate sale, that's why the number of buyers has been steadily increasing over the last 10 years, from something like, I think it was on average, an average of 6 or 7 to more like 12 or 15 now. And that number gets even higher when we get into especially complex sales. So the information trends are having a really noticeable impact on just the buying committee and the degree of complexity that companies feel they need to master, and therefore it's complicating the sales challenge that a seller has in trying to persuade that committee, right? So that's one thing. COVID itself, as everyone I think knows by now, has had a major impact on just the inbound and outbound that define our world, right? So if we have noticed that the volume of outreach, of just email outreach, has gone up quite significantly since COVID. And as you would expect, with the increase in outbound, there's been a decrease in the response rates. So I think COVID has dramatically reduced people's or stakeholders' readiness to respond to sellers, made them less willing to respond, less likely to respond. And so that's another major trend that has affected the sales landscape. And it's, we can say a little bit more about that if we want to pursue that thread. The third is AI. Everyone's talking about AI now. And I think that AI is clearly one of the most important things going on right now. Maybe one of the most important things that has ever gone on with respect to human evolution. And it's relevant to sales because, and there's a tie-in a sense with the information trends we were describing earlier, which is, as the information landscape becomes more and more dense and more complicated, more difficult to wrap our heads around, AI becomes more and more significant as a way to make sense of that world. And so this is one of the reasons I think why AI is now becoming so popular and such a talking point, is that we have developed vast amounts of data. We're swimming in data, but we're sort of thirsting for insight. And AI is probably the only hope that we have at this point to try to help us make sense of the patterns and emergent insights within all the data that we've created. And so I think that's the reason why AI is becoming really, really important to sales and many other domains right now. So those would be my 3 trends that I think are most significant.
So you talked about AI in terms of can help us to understand. So what are some of the implications potentially? What does this mean for a seller, for an SME seller, in terms of gaining insights, how they can incorporate that into part of their sales process? Can you maybe unpack that as some of the implications and how, again, for an SME seller, what does that mean for them? What do they should start thinking about, start to do? That would be great.
Yeah, sure. So I think again, let's try to make it really. I can speak about just some of the things that I've observed within a LinkedIn context, which are maybe quite relatable to someone that is in an SMB capacity. So if there's just been a real change in the way that we use data. I would say historically data was basically designed for warehousing and retrieval. We built these CRM databases, for instance, and we built other data repositories, and then we made those repositories available to our teams, who could then retrieve that data and use it on an ad hoc, as needed basis. I think that was a traditional approach to data, and because of the fact that there's just so much of it now, and because all that data is so much more dynamic, given all the changes that are happening, I think that sort of assumption of warehousing and retrieval is just, it doesn't make as much sense anymore. Now it's much more about how you find signals in the data. And so AI if you think about the way LinkedIn works, LinkedIn has made some very, very deliberate investments in AI technology, because we understand that for a seller to be effective, it's not just that you have to have access, let's say, to the LinkedIn network, which is now almost 1 billion professionals. It's not just that you need access to that network as a kind of data repository. You also need to know what are the movements that are happening in that entity, that massive digital entity of the LinkedIn network, that can help you develop a relationship and advance a deal. So instead of just having a kind of repository of, let's say, phone numbers and emails, in my CRM system, I now want to be looking for data signals. I want LinkedIn, for example, to help me understand, okay, these are the 10 people who have joined that company in the last 90 days, in the last 30 days. That's a signal. That's a very useful signal for me to know about. Here is an individual who used to be with one of our top clients, who has now moved into one of the accounts that's in our territory. That's a signal. That's very important for me to know. So these are the kinds of real-time signals that are being served up to us by taking these data foundations that we built, and by having AI kind of instantaneously scour that database and serve up these real-time signals, right? So that's what I mean when I say that AI is becoming just an essential partner as we try to make better use of all these data foundations that we built.
All right, so that's great. So it's about leveraging AI to help us gain those insights by helping us to find those signals that'll be relevant to the industry and the companies that you as an SMB seller are operating in.
Right.
Awesome. Douglas, I'd like to transition a little bit and now start talking about the book. And you talk about in your book, and what I love about your book is you talk about the 3 key roles that sellers need to have. I think what you've done there is brilliant, because by nature of what B2B buyers, how they're doing a lot of that self-serve, independent researching, they're trying to connect the dots. It is really, from my perspective, really raise the bar as to what sellers need to do. Can we start to unpack talk about those 3 roles that B2B sellers need to have? Starting off with your first one is the role of strategist.
Yeah, sure. Well, I would just take a quick step back and just say that for me, one of the things that I'm trying to do, that I became very interested in doing from the time that I got into sales, was finding a way to elevate the sales profession. Sales is a profession that has a lot of dignity to it. It also has a bad reputation, I think, to some extent deservedly, but in many instances not deservedly. And I think that it is a profession that needs to be reframed in some sense. And one of the ways in which that I've tried to reframe sales, especially sales when it comes to selling to corporate buyers, is by trying to define what it is the seller is doing in a way that I think does more justice to the reality. So my observation is that a person who's trying to sell to a company buyer is basically operating on 3 levels. You have one foot in the external environment. You're very attentive to what's going on in that outside environment, and what are the competitors doing? How is your client adjusting to those competitor movements and so forth? So there's an external dimension to it. Then there's an organizational dimension where you are attentive to the current initiatives within that company, who are the people who are setting the pace and the tone within that company and so forth, right? So there's this organizational component. And then there's this interpersonal component, the actual particular interests and needs and desires of that person you're working with. So you have this external, organizational, and interpersonal dimension, all of which sort of overlap and are all important, but you sort of emphasize them to a different degree as a seller. And what I'm saying in the book is that, maybe the heuristic I'm using is that when you're working with that external dimension, you are essentially a strategist. You as a seller need to come across as a credible strategist. If you are focusing on that organizational dimension, you are effectively a change agent. You are trying to understand, where is the energy coming from in this organization? How do I feed that energy? That's a change agent mandate. And then with respect to that interpersonal dimension, you are effectively a decision architect. And so that's about you becoming conversant in some of these key psychological principles, and understanding how to maximize your effectiveness within that interpersonal dimension. So that's what I'm arguing, is that to that first point you said about the strategist, the role of the seller as strategist is trying to understand that external dimension, and is trying to position the client effectively within it.
Got you. And as part of doing that, which leads me to, in your book, you talk about there's kind of there's two critical questions in that role as a strategist. There's two critical questions that you need to be able to answer about your client. Could you talk a little bit about that for our listeners? Because I think they will find that quite useful as some of the things that they should be doing.
Sure. Yes. Well, I'll give you the two questions by telling you, first of all, what I'm trying to do by boiling things down to two questions. So strategy is an area strategy is a term that people use a lot, and it's one of these somewhat meaningless terms, I would say. It's a little bit too flexible. People generally mean sort of higher level thinking, but strategy does actually have a fairly specific definition to it. And strategy is fundamentally about choices and trade-offs. It's fundamentally as much about what a company decides not to do as what it decides to do, and it's usually the outcome of a very extensive process of deliberation and reflection on all the different options and the various ways in which we could be making money as a business, and saying, we are not going to do all these things. We're actually going to focus on this particular market, this particular ICP, because we believe that that's where we have the greatest competitive advantage with respect to that person's options, right? It's a very, very deliberate choice and trade-off that's being made. That's what a strategy is when it's done right. And so the two questions that I'm suggesting that a seller asks with respect to that external dimension are, where do they compete and how do they win? Those are the two key questions, because those two questions get to the heart of the trade-offs. Where do they compete? In other words, what area of the market have they decided matters most to them? What is that segment? What is that industry? Who is that target buyer, right? That's what's implied with the question of where they compete. And then how do they win is intended to get the seller to think about the competitive advantages of this business. What makes them different from other companies who are trying to do something that's either in the same space or in an adjacent space? Well, what will distinguish them? And if a seller understands those two things, if a seller understands where that company is trying to focus in terms of winning revenue or market share, and how it thinks it's going to be successful in doing that, then that seller is in a position to say, here's how I can help you. Here's how I can help you within that external environment. Given the specifics of your focus, this is how I can help you win.
God, awesome. So in terms of helping sellers get into SMB sellers, in terms of what are the things they need to be doing to get into that right strategic mindset? Because you have some good points and some suggestions around what it means around mindset. Because for many sellers generally in B2B, you're really, this whole strategic thinking and answering these two strategic questions is a very different way of thinking. So from a mindset perspective, to help folks kind of get in the zone, can you give us a couple suggestions, tips to help them set themselves into that strategic mindset?
Well, I think one of the simplest questions that you can ask yourself, and one of the things I talk about in the book, is to bring a level of empathy to the business, empathy that's not really so much rooted in your key point of contact on the client side, but empathy for the ultimate buyer. And so I think the most sophisticated sellers that I have observed, they don't just think about that business. They don't just think about their customer. They think of the customer of their customer. And because when you try to put yourself in the shoes of the customer of your customer, you are really forced to answer the question of where do they compete and how do they win. Because when you understand who their target buyer is, and then you sort of put yourself in that person's shoes and you imagine, okay, well, what's the problem I'm trying to solve? What are the options available to me? How are they positioned? How is my client positioned, as one of those options? How do I see these alternatives in terms of their pros and cons? How do I see maybe the secondary benefits of each solution? Are there ways in which each of those solutions, is more easily integrated into my workflow or tech stack or whatever, right? And so I think of that, to me, is a really simple way, a very simple bottom-up way to change your mind, is just to ask yourself, okay, the customer of my customer, how is that person looking at this business, and how can I describe my value proposition through that lens, because that is really going to get to the heart of what it will take for them to win.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense, Douglas, because if you are being empathetic and thinking from the end customer perspective and understanding the implications of what to deliver, how to deliver, that's ultimately going to benefit them, then the benefits will feed to your immediate customer, the B2B buyer. So it will ultimately, hopefully, lead to a win-win situation. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
Awesome. The next role you talk about is the role of the change agent. And can you talk a little bit about that? And I noticed in your book you talked about the present bias. I thought that concept as about being the starting point. Could you talk a little bit about that whole idea, the role of the change agent, what's its key focus, and that notion around that present bias? Because I thought that was quite enlightening and quite useful for our listeners.
Sure. Yeah. Well, as in this section, as with the previous section on strategy, I try to boil things down to a couple of questions as a starting point. Yeah. And so once again, just before I get to those questions, just a quick bit of context on them. For me, the most important thing to bear in mind with respect to seller as change agent is that when you are trying to get a client to move in a new direction, ideally, you're not treating this as kind of like a physics problem. You're treating it as a chemistry problem. So in other words, you're not sort of saying, okay, well, there's a wall here, I need to push them through this wall. You're trying to create some kind of catalytic reaction that leads to knock-on effects, right? And so in other words, you don't want to be in a situation where you're sort of forcibly directing them in a certain direction that they may not want to go in. You are finding what is already going on, and you're thinking about how you can make that even stronger, right? So in other words, the two questions are, where is the energy for change coming from already within this organization, and how can I feed that energy? In any company in 2023, there is going to be some kind of major change initiative. There's no company that doesn't have a major change program underway, if not multiple change programs underway, right? That's just the nature of the world we live in right now, where no one is standing still. Any business that's standing still is going to be out of business within a couple of years or a few months. So everyone has a change agenda that's underway. And so this becomes the key question for a seller. Where is the energy for change coming, and how can I feed that energy? And you will generally find that in any organization, there is a major initiative. And so when I talk about present bias, I think that it has to be put in this context. First of all, find that energy source, find out who's championing it, find out how you can attach the benefits of your product or solution to that initiative in some way. But also understand that in trying to, let's say, evangelize that concept and sort of drive it to broader adoption across that business, you are going to be encountering present bias. You are going to be encountering people whose basic orientation is to favor the present, because it's much easier to default to the present than it is to think about a future that may or may not be better or worse. I mean, that's just the way our mind works. Whether we're talking about something that's better in the future or worse than the future, we just don't give it as much weight as what is happening in the moment. I will eat a chocolate eclair because I don't think it's going to affect me in the long term, and I will not exercise, even though that will benefit me in the long term, right? Because I'm tethered to the moment. That's present bias. So So the change agent is, first of all, finding out what that energy, what that energy source is, attaching your product or your service benefit to that, and it is trying to find a way of making the benefits of the future as close to the present as possible, so that it doesn't seem like a distant possibility. And that's, I mean, that, a lot of that is about tying yourself to that change initiative. It's something that people are talking about now. It's something that's being emphasized in team meetings and in Company Connect and all hands meetings. And it's already high priority. Therefore, it feels as though it's more in the present, and we need to do something about it. Here's how we can help.
Okay, great. Any tips as to how, in terms of identifying where that energy is coming from? Any tips of how to go about finding that?
I think, I think it is just asking very pointed questions. So, for instance, in our organization, we sell to sales organizations, and so one of the questions that we will ask, well, what was the theme of your sales kickoff this year? When you gather the entire staff together, what was the one thing that the one unifying theme that leadership decided should be the focus of this year's sales kickoff, right? If you were selling to a different part of the organization, if it were the finance organization, for example, or the legal organization, what have you, there would be some equivalent of that. There would be some annual, let's call it an offsite, or that where there would be some equivalent of that unifying theme. And I think that's the key question you need to ask is, when you hear, when you're in your meetings with your direct reports and with your executives, what is the one thing that they're talking about as being the most important agenda for your team this year? That's the kind of question that allows you to see very quickly, what's getting people's attention and where the energy is coming from.
Awesome, awesome. And again, Douglas, as I asked about the strategists, in terms of changing, because some of these are new behaviors, concepts, from a mindset perspective, what sort of mindset in terms of being able to function effectively as a change agent? What are some tips? What's the perspective that sellers, SME sellers need to be thinking of if they're looking to be functioning effectively as a change agent?
Well, again, I think it is a matter of empathizing with the right people, right? So when we talked about the strategy angle, we were trying to use empathy in order to understand the perspective of my customer's customer. I think that in this particular case, empathy is also appropriate, but it's a different individual. I think if we figure out the source of energy, if we figure out how to feed that, and we figure out who really stands to benefit from this program, we want to ask ourselves how we can get ourselves in that person's headspace. I mean, in one of the examples I use in the book was we were trying to sell this program, and the CFO was obviously committed to the success of a very significant investment that he had made in the CRM system, a sort of gold-plated CRM that they had bought with all the bells and whistles. And our program had a real shot at making that guy look good, because the kinds of behaviors that we were trying to drive would make his CRM would make the CRM stickier, and therefore it would validate the investment, right? So I think there's an empathy component that applies to the change agent task as well. And then I think it just, when I go back to the elevating the seller, I think that as sellers, what we're trying to do is sort of think of ourselves as having just massive leverage effects. We are usually just one person or a small team that's trying to affect a full organization, and so to think of yourself as being someone who's really good at leverage, using every opportunity to make that whole organization feel your presence. How can you find a way to get embedded in one-to-many communications within that organization that are related to this initiative that you found, that gets your message out in a one-to-many capacity? I think that's sort of the headspace you need to be thinking. It's a little bit like the advertising profession. How do you get maximum reach and resonance as a seller?
Excellent. Awesome. And the third role, Douglas, decision architect. Can you talk to us in terms of what are some of the key fundamental questions, some of the key roles as a seller operating in that capacity as a decision architect?
Yeah, sure. Well, here in this space, I'm drawing a lot. I'm borrowing quite a bit from this area of behavioral economics, which is a bit of a trendy area these days. Behavioral economics is sort of it was a later development within traditional economics when economists finally realized that human beings are not entirely rational. That had been the assumption for decades in traditional economics, and then finally people like Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky and Richard Thaler and all these godfathers of behavioral economics, they pointed out with a lot of evidence that human beings are not particularly rational, and all kinds of experiments proved it. And what I noticed is that the basic structure for behavioral economics is very relatable to someone who works in sales. Because what they talk about in behavioral economics is they talk about these three boundaries or limits of human psychology. They talk about these bounds of attention and bounds of rationality and bounds of self-interest. And I think that is really interesting because it maps on pretty much exactly to the challenge that a seller has. As a seller, you need to find a way to move within bounds of attention. You need to get someone's attention to start off with. Otherwise, you have no hope of selling anything. Then you have to get someone to make a judgment about your product or service, which is essentially operating within the bounds of rationality. And then finally, you have to operate within these bounds of self-interest. You need to find a way to get that person to act, to do something. And so these three dimensions of behavioral economics are directly applicable to what it is that a seller needs to do in order to be successful. And so I sort of go through each of those challenges: attention, rationality, self-interest, and talk about a couple of behavioral economics principles that are quite practical when it comes to the seller's challenges. So for instance, working within bounds of attention, or rationality rather, I talk a lot about the contrast principle. When you want someone to make a judgment about a product or service, we as humans find it extremely hard to judge anything in the absence of a contrast. We need to have some kind of comparison, some point of comparison in order to understand. So if someone's asking you for a price, or if someone's asking you for a product, or for any kind of question, always ask yourself, how can I show contrast in order to highlight the relative advantages or disadvantages of the option that I consider to be in this client's best interest?
Okay, so I guess from a practical perspective, that means in terms of preparing for meetings and discussion, making sure you have some of those points and those points of comparison to be able to do so. Any tips around that whole, the boundaries around attention? Any suggestions for sellers in terms of how they might try to address that whole gaining of attention, dealing with that boundary challenge with respect to attention?
Well, there's a very well-known book that's been around for many years called Influence by Robert Cialdini. And I talk about that book and some of the principles that he introduced as being quite relevant to attention. That book presents this really interesting overview of these what he call influence levers, things like social proof and authority and consistency and reciprocity and so forth. And I think it's really important for sellers to have that stuff just completely internalized, because those principles are timeless principles with respect to the way human beings operate. And I think that anytime you are thinking of a high stakes communication, if it's an email or a PowerPoint deck or a meeting agenda, I think you need to ask yourself, how am I incorporating those principles in order to maximize attention? Because it's always the case that they are going to be relevant, in some respect. What I was saying before about contrast is you see connections between even that principle and influence levers, because quite often what you can show with contrast is that that there's this sense in which someone is going to be missing out on something, right? Or maybe there's some sort of social proof that you've woven into that contrast to show that this option, is maybe more valid because industry experts or industry peers have already validated it, as an example, right? So you can start to see how these things blend together after a while, but you know, hopefully that helps.
Definitely. And finally, so Douglas, so any tips for an SMB seller who's, because these three rules are quite critical given how buyers are behaving and what they're doing. In terms of getting started, what and for a seller, for our listeners out there who are wanting to try to start moving in the direction of adopting some of these three rules, any tips as to how to get started? What are some things they can do to start setting themselves, their teams, if you're a sales leader, in starting to kind of setting them in this direction with respect to these three rules? Is there any tips of how they can get started? Some things they can start to do to move the dial, so to speak?
Yeah, well, I think it is probably, as with everything, or so many things anyway, it's a question of prioritization, right? We can't do everything. And I think in many cases, and especially in an SMB space, you might be working with multiple accounts, right? And so the question is, what are your most important accounts? In any domain, there's always some version of the 80-20 rule where 20% of the accounts, it's actually quite often even fewer, are going to be responsible for 80% or more of the ultimate revenue that you think you can drive, right? And so the question is, what are those critical few accounts? And that's question number one. And then for those critical few accounts, I think it does make sense to apply these simple questions. Is to say, if I'm going to be the best possible advisor to this company, then as a strategist, I need to be able to say, at least with regard to my critical few, where do they compete and how do they win? Where is the energy for change coming from? How do I feed that energy? Those are the two critical questions that I think you need to be able to answer for, I guess, in two areas, but with regard to your critical few accounts. And so that's what I would say, the prioritization, and then, distillation of your hypothesis with regard to the strategic angle and the change agent angle, before we get into the decision architect stuff, which is more person specific.
Okay. Awesome. Any watch outs, anything to be mindful of for SMB sellers as they're looking to, these are great things to do. Is there any hazards, any watch outs in terms of as they're looking to kind of navigate themselves into this new way, deeper way of selling that they should just be mindful of?
Well, I think that is just, with the kinds of things we're talking about, which is sort of a mindset shift. That's something that takes time. It's not something. I didn't write this book in order to recommend just a drop and drag set of process steps that you simply follow, and then all of a sudden you're earning 10 times more revenue. What I'm trying to impart here is that these are principles. These are principles of success. These are first principles that I think underlie the best performers that I've seen within sales. And it takes time to build these mental habits, but they are ultimately, I think, the most powerful levers that we have from a success standpoint. There was a famous quote from Stephen Covey, the guy who wrote The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, where he said, if you're interested in incremental change, focus on behavior. He said, if you're interested in quantum change, focus on the paradigm or the mindset. And so that's what we're trying to focus on here. And it's a long game.
Yes, and I think that's inherent in B2B, and that's fantastic. Douglas, thank you so much. This has been, I think, truly an enlightening discussion in terms of, how do we change our mindset? How do we really evolve to really meet the needs of today's new, challenging but ever demanding and changing B2B buyers? Douglas, how can folks, where can they find the book? How can they connect with you? Please let us know.
Sure. Yeah. Easiest way to buy the book is on Amazon. And the easiest way to follow or connect with me is either through signing up to or just go to the salesmba.ca. And on that website, you can sign up for a newsletter either on LinkedIn or on Substack. I do both. And that's probably the easiest way. feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. That works too.
Awesome. Well, Douglas, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. To our attendees and listeners across YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, again, thank you so much. Enjoy your day. Please stay in tune. I look forward to seeing you on the next time on Breaking Through B2B. For more insights pertaining to the world of B2B for us as SMEs, please be sure to go to the website, listeninnovategrow.com. Until next time, I'm Michael Haynes. Take care and see you next time.